Enjoy listening to this and other great podcasts from Jacob's Tent? Want even more content from us? Download the Jacob's Tent app today and gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
In the last several weeks, it seems that developments are emerging all over the world, some of them prophetic. So much is happening all at once that a lot of people are beginning to grow nervous and some are even downright scared. In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to look at some of the news coming out of Syria, Gaza, and here in the United States to see what these developments mean for the people of God. Are we seeing the results of man's agenda or the hand of God at work?
Welcome to the Weekly Scroll, sharing biblical thoughts on current events. Scroll through today's top headlines with Bill Cloud as he unravels the political and spiritual implications of the world we live in, all through the lens of Scripture. Now, be encouraged, be challenged, and be ready.
Well, welcome to the Weekly Scroll. In the last few weeks, a lot has been occurring in the world, including in the Middle East, perhaps especially in the Middle East. In Syria, militants loyal to the deposed Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched an ambush against the new Syrian regime's security forces. In retaliation for this attack, over 1,300 people have been killed, mainly in the coastal area in the heart of the Alawite minority, a group to which al-Assad belonged. The outbreak of violence quickly escalated into the largest challenge to this new government's forces since Assad was toppled back in December. And as a result of these hostilities, the interim president, Ahmed al-Shawra'a, a man who at one time was on the United States terrorist watch list and actually had a $10 million reward on his head. Anyway, he called for an end to the fighting, saying, "We must preserve national unity and civil peace as much as possible, and God willing, we will be able to live together in this country." Now, a British-based group said that many of the casualties included women and children, some of whom were killed in executions carried out by these security personnel or pro-government fighters. It was also reported that there was widespread looting of homes and properties. One resident of Banyas told the press that two of his brothers and his niece were killed by armed groups that entered the people's homes. And then he added that among these security forces were foreigners. One Alawite woman told Fox News that security forces said, "Alawites are pigs, and they have to execute all of them, the small children and the elderly." Now, this current government in Syria is led by an Islamist group known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and I probably didn't say that correctly, or better known as HTS. And their roots are actually in the Syrian branch of what was Al-Qaeda, and to this day remains categorized as a terrorist organization by the United States government. But since gaining power, its leaders have tried to moderate their rhetoric and have vowed to protect Syria's religious and ethnic minorities. Now, some aren't so convinced of their sincerity. Instead, some are interpreting this violence as a bad sign or even a bad omen. You may recall that Tulsi Gabbard, who's now the director of national intelligence, warned that a terrorist takeover in Syria would likely lead to the killing of many minorities in Syria, including the dwindling Christian community. At Gabbard's Senate confirmation hearing, she said, "I have no love for Assad or any dictator. I just hate Al-Qaeda. I hate that our leaders cozy up to Islamist extremists, calling them rebels. Syria is now controlled by Al-Qaeda or by an Al-Qaeda offshoot HTS, led by an Islamist jihadist who danced in the streets on 9/11 and who was responsible for the killing of many American soldiers." Now, multiple sources confirm that there have been mass killings of Christians in Syria under this new regime. Some people call it revenge killing. Some are calling it ethnic cleansing. But it appears, and this is the point, that Tulsi Gabbard may have been correct. There are reports of armed forces going into houses, terrorizing people, and even slaughtering children. They're dropping bodies in the streets, one source said. And so it's becoming increasingly clear that though the world was rid of one dictator, it was probably replaced, or he was probably replaced with another. By the way, Syria is not the only place where believers are threatened by Islamic-fueled violence. It's happening in other Mideast countries. It's happening in several African nations. Islamists go into Christian villages and they either kidnap people or they kill them. And so we obviously need to be praying for our brothers and sisters who are in harm's way. Now, back in Syria, at one point in this violent clash, gunfire broke out between Syrian security forces and Druze gunmen in a Damascus suburb. One Druze fighter was killed and 9 others were wounded. And this activity prompted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz to instruct the IDF to, quote, prepare to defend the Druze majority city of Yaramana on the outskirts of Damascus. Perhaps you are not aware that there is a large Druze community that lives in Israel, particularly in the northern regions around Mount Carmel. Now, Israel made this statement also: we will not allow the extreme Islamic regime in Syria to harm the Druze. If the regime harms the Druze, it will be struck by us. We are committed to our Druze brothers in Israel to do everything to prevent harm to their Druze brothers in Syria, and we will take all the steps required to maintain their safety. The same sentiment was echoed by Netanyahu, who added this: we demand full demilitarization. Now, this sentiment was echoed by Netanyahu, who added, we demand full demilitarization. Demilitarization. This sentiment was echoed by Netanyahu, who added, we demand full demilitarization of southern Syria from troops of the new Syrian regime in the Quneitra, Daraa, and Suwaida provinces. And I'm sure I butchered those pronunciations, but this, nonetheless, was a move on Israel's part to diminish the threats to the Druze community that live in southern Syria. When the Assad regime in Syria fell, you may recall that the IDF moved in to capture a buffer zone between the two countries on the Syrian side of the border as a defensive measure. Military posts were established and were to remain there, according to Netanyahu, for a, quote, unlimited period of time. And while this occupying this buffer zone was presented as an effort to protect Israel's border communities, recent developments have the potential to change things. In other words, instead of just defending their own borders, the IDF is now poised to move deeper into Syria, into Damascus, no less, to protect others. And that's what makes all of this interesting, at least to me, because as we know, the Bible makes some very striking comments about the future of Syria and especially Damascus. Specifically, Damascus is singled out in a prophecy in Isaiah that says Damascus will cease from being a city and it will be a ruinous heap. Now, I realize that there are many ways that this prophecy could be fulfilled, and there have been those who felt that the years-long civil war in Syria might play a role in bringing this to pass, and it may yet. But with the potential for hostilities between Israel and this new regime in Syria, this prophecy is certainly one for us to keep in mind as these things continue to develop. Now, while we're talking about things in that particular region, Israel's war with Hamas lingers on in spite of efforts to bring an end to the Gazan conflict. Specifically, talks between Israel and Hamas appeared to break down when the first phase of this ceasefire deal expired at the beginning of March. And when it expired, there was no agreement reached on going forward or any subsequent stages to this particular agreement. In short, that means this: the remaining hostages are still in captivity and their futures are uncertain. So then, in order to increase pressure, Israel cut off the electrical supply into Gaza, and they halted all deliveries of aid and assistance into the Gaza Strip. Energy Minister Eli Cohen said, "We will use all the tools at our disposal to bring back the hostages and ensure that Hamas is no longer in Gaza the day after the war." As a result of this activity, Gazans rely mainly on solar panels and fuel-powered generators to produce electricity. Also, given the destruction in the region, hundreds of thousands of Gazans are now living in tents. One Hamas spokesman said, "To cut off electricity to Gaza after depriving it of food, medicine, and water is a desperate attempt to pressure our people and their resistance." He added that this move by Israel also poses a threat to the remaining hostages. Now, Hamas has repeatedly demanded that this second phase of the truce, if it should develop, among other things, will have to include a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, a permanent ceasefire, and then the reopening of border crossings to end the blockade. And while there are those who believe that an agreement between the two might be on the horizon, it's reported that the Trump administration is ready to back any Israeli decision, and including one that they return to war and hostilities. As a matter of fact, you may recall that in late February, President Trump issued what he called a last warning to Hamas, threatening further destruction if the group does not release all remaining hostages. In fact, according to one retired United States Air Force Brigadier General, who happens to be in the know, or so it seems, he said Trump is very serious about this ultimatum for Hamas to release all the remaining hostages. According to Brigadier General Blaine Holt, if that doesn't happen, they, that is Hamas, might get to meet certain members of our very special forces. Now, I have to say that the possibility of a joint military effort between the United States and Israel is fascinating to consider, especially in light of some prophecies regarding the land of Israel in the last days and how things come about. Now, Holt went on to say that the United States is repairing and reintegrating its relationship and its alliance with the IDF, and they're ready to go. They've had time to recuperate and develop intelligence, which is very important. In other words, it seems that he is suggesting that this ceasefire has given the IDF time to gather more intelligence, and should hostilities return, and if the United States happens to be involved, well, everybody's ready to go. Now, Trump's ultimatum, in tandem with his proposal for the future of Gaza, reworking it, developing it, those kinds of things, relocating all those Gazans, all of that is bringing a lot of pressure to bear, and not just on Hamas, but it's pressuring other nations in the region. Supposedly, Egypt's getting very nervous about the growing probability that they will have to take in Gazan refugees. It's been reported that other Arab nations are already talking behind closed doors about how to take displaced Gazans into their countries. So it seems that there are many countries in the Middle East who are feeling the effects of this full court press by Trump. And on that note, Trump is applying maximum pressure to the leadership in Iran. Trump revealed that he sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Boy, I have trouble with these Arabic names. Anyway, he sent a letter to the supreme leader pushing for Tehran to comply with a nuclear agreement or face military consequences. Trump has signaled that a nuclear deal with Iran could emerge in the near future, but he also admitted that it's down to the final moments when it comes to negotiating with the nation. Trump also said, "It's an interesting time in the history of the world. I would rather negotiate a deal. I'm not sure that everybody agrees with me, but we can make a deal that would be just as good as if you won militarily. Hopefully, we can have a peace deal. I'd rather see a peace deal than the other. And by that, he means military intervention. But, he says, the other will solve the problem. Now, I have to agree with the president. It is an interesting time in the world. We live in a time when there are multiple wars. There's threat of other wars. There's even the potential for some of these wars to be prophetic and of biblical proportions. I want you to consider this. The war that's described in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the so-called War of Gog of Magog, it mentions all these different nations that are part of this confederacy that align themselves with Gog. But I've always found it interesting, very intriguing, that of all those nations, Syria is never mentioned. And is it because, maybe, that previous to this particular battle in Ezekiel 38 and 9, what's described in Isaiah 17 has already occurred? In other words, before the Gog of Magog war occurs, Damascus has already been reduced to a ruinous heap? We'll have to wait and see. Now, as a sidebar, there are other elements to this particular prophecy in Isaiah 17 that we haven't discussed, and I really don't have time today to do that, but I am going to go ahead and float out this thought. If Gazans do end up being relocated, as Trump would like to do, if they're relocated to other nations in that region, if other nations are already talking behind closed doors about having to do this, I would not be surprised in the least if Jordan happens to be one of those nations. Furthermore, I would not be surprised if some of those Gazans, by the way, people who pretty much support Hamas and support the destruction of Israel, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those people end up being relocated to an area in Jordan that's just east of Jericho, just east of the Dead Sea, in a region along the river called Arnon in the Bible, but now it's known as Wadi Mujib. That region was once home to the Moabites and the Edomites. Now, why am I saying this? Because the prophecy in Isaiah says that at the time Damascus is destroyed, the cities of Auror are forsaken. In other words, Damascus end might come at the same time that those who have claimed the land of Israel as their own, people that the Bible calls the remnant of the nations and all of Edom, it might be that as Damascus is destroyed, those nations are dealt a death blow by God's justice. Now, to fully understand this, you have to go back and read Ezekiel 35, Ezekiel 36, read Obadiah, read Isaiah 17. I'm not making a prediction here. I'm just saying, based on the prophecies, I wouldn't be surprised to see this happen. We'll see. Now, also considering that there is a possibility that the United States, along with Israel, might end up fighting some of the same people, that is fascinating. Again, time will tell, and it may not come to that, but it's very interesting. But even without that, there's still enough going on in the world that you and I as believers should be on high alert. Now, not scared, but prepared. And when it comes to preparation, not preparing in light of what men may do, but preparing for what God is doing. I continually hear from folks that they're worried, they're scared, because so much change and so much disruption is going on all the time and at the same time. We have tariff wars, immigration wars, drug wars. There's a divided Congress. Russia and Ukraine are at war. There's these threats in Syria, threats from Iran, and all over the place. So looking at this, some folks are of the view that so much is happening all at once that it must mean that we're on the verge of complete chaos. Is it that? Or is it that God is preparing to restore order to what has been chaos? I want to interject kind of an interesting thought, and some of you might appreciate this. Some of you may not get the connection. But back in the 60s, the Beatles did a song called A Day in the Life. And at the end of the song, if you're familiar with it, there is a section where you hear this noise, this cacophony of different instruments, nobody playing the same notes, but it's building, and it just sounds like a bunch of noise, chaotic, if you will. But then all at the same time, the chaos ends, and then there's this chord. And this chord brings everything back together. It's like everything is building chaotically, and then order is restored. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. From our perspective, God seems to take his time when it comes to acting on certain fronts. However, when he does take action, that is action that you and I can observe, it happens suddenly. So yes, men have been doing things. There's been disruption. People have their agendas, and there is a lot happening right now. And to a lot of people, it seems like chaos. But I'm going to suggest to you that maybe these things that are building is evidence that God is about to restore order. And then all of a sudden, everything's going to come into focus. Everything's going to take shape. And then we're going to realize that God has been orchestrating things all along. And so, on that note, that God does things suddenly, I'm going to close with this famous passage from the Olivet Discourse. Messiah said this, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows." Well, it sounds chaotic, but he also made this very clear. When these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. It may seem like a bunch of noise, a lot of things happening, all at the same time, no rhyme or reason to it, and that upsets people. Or it may be that all these things are happening because the hand of God is at work. And very soon, and very suddenly, everything will come together as he's ordained. And so, in the words of the Messiah, it's not time to be afraid and scared. It's time to look up and to realize our redemption is near.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest updates from Bill, and check out other podcasts available from Jacob's Tent. And join us next week on The Weekly Scroll.